We are live.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our work group on English learners. Again, we appreciate your time. I'm Dr. Deanne Collins, Deputy State Superintendent for the Office of Teaching and Learning here at the Maryland State Department of Education. And I bring you greetings on behalf of State Superintendent, Mr. Mohammed Chaudhary. Mr. Chaudhary is still in another meeting. So if he is able to join us, he will be participating again today. But thank you all again for making the time to join us. Next slide. As a reminder for all of our meetings, this meeting is being recorded and live streamed via MSDE's YouTube channel. So today we are having another action-packed, exciting meeting. Our guiding question that will frame our discussion for today is, how can Maryland align the science of reading and structured literacy with best English language development practices to improve reading outcomes for English learners? So that is our guiding question for today. We are honored to have some guests to talk about some national best practices and research, who I'll introduce shortly. And then we'll talk about Maryland's existing policies and practices that align to our guiding question, and then end with a discussion and recommendations as we finalize our English learner report. So we are delighted today to have a panel where we're going to spotlight national best practices. We're really going to engage in a discussion where they'll help provide a deeper understanding of how to best align the science of reading and structured literacy to support best practices for English learner development. Our guests are very well known in the field. You might have seen them or participated in some of the webinars or presentations that they've done. So we know how busy they are, and we are very, very appreciative. We have Dr. Elsa Cartagenas-Hagan, President of Valley Speech Language and Learning Center in Houston. She's a research associate. Dr. Antonio Fierro, he's the Chief Impact Officer for Educator Preparation Curriculum. And then Dr. Claude Goldenberg, Professor of Education, Stanford Graduate School of Education. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are super excited to hear from you and learn from you. So at this time, I will turn it over to Laurel to facilitate our panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Collins. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to our guest. Oh, yes, and Dr. Fierro's camera is working. We were just texting about that, so that's wonderful. So I'm going to invite our panel to take a moment to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll move into, we have several questions we've prepared that we'd like our presenters to address. So I will call on Dr. Goldenberg first, if he'd like to take a moment to introduce himself.
Sure. Thanks, Laurel. And thanks to everyone for attending. I'm delighted. I'm sure we're all delighted to be here with you. I'm Claude Goldenberg. I'm actually not at the School of Education anymore. I retired a few years ago to allow me to spend more time doing interesting events such as this one. So I'm very happy to be here with you. I formerly taught junior high and first grade, mostly in Latino, largely immigrant communities in Texas and in California. And I was formerly at the California State University, Long Beach. Then I went to Stanford for the last 10 or 12 years before retiring. Most of the work I do is with English language learners, which I guess is the reason I'm here. So thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. Let's move up to Dr. Fierro.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. It's great to be here with all of you. It's particularly a lot of fun to be with my esteemed colleagues and friends, Claude and Elsa. And in fact, Elsa is just across the hall from me. We are at the Mississippi College in Clinton, Mississippi today, and talking about ELs. So Claude, we missed you. You should have been here, man.
Well, nobody invited me.
Oops, that was Elsa's fault. So
I was
am,
invited.
I am still very involved with the state of Mississippi as a visiting professor, working with faculty across the state. I'm no longer with the Barksdale Reading Institute, but still very much involved in their work. Unfortunately, Barksdale is going to sunset in July of next year. But let me tell you, Barksdale was one of the driving forces behind the wonderful reading results that we had back in 2019. And I'm just so fortunate that I was a part of that as I was working again with university professors across the state. My partner in crime and colleague, Dr. Mary Dahlgren, and I wrote a phonetics curriculum that is now been really extended, and we're working on other pieces. So along with working with Mississippi, still writing and working on curriculum that works for all kiddos, but we're paying close attention to English learners. And again, it's great to be here. Sorry about the little technical glitches, but that's what happens when the computer doesn't recognize the systems, the new systems that you're on. So, and Claude, I promise you, I said invite you, and Elsa was like, I don't know.
Not
Okay, blackballed
true.
again. Okay, that's all right. I won't take it personally.
Well, last but certainly not least, I invite Dr. Elsa Cardenas Hagen to tell us a little bit about herself.
Thank you so much. And oh my, it's wonderful to be here coming to you from Mississippi where Claude wasn't invited. No. So, but no, we were honored to be invited to speak at a conference really related to individuals that are really responsible for working with students with dyslexia, and very excited about the good turnout and the interest in the subject of English learners. I'm Elsa Cardenas Hagen, the president of the Valley Speech Language and Learning Center, and also research associate at the University of Houston Times. And it is through that association that I was able to, first get to meet Claude and the Biliteracy Research Network, which was started, almost 25 years ago. And get to really look at this work. And it really stemmed from, I like to tell the story of, all it takes is a small group of people working together to change the world. And for us in Brownsville, it was a group of 5 for Brownsville Reads. And we invited Louisa Moats, a very, esteemed colleague and mentor to many of us, and to come, and Dr. Reed Lyon. And it was then that Reed was talking about the research and all that existed, but our teachers were like, what about the English learner? Because that's what we have. And so he went back and got the $30 million from United States Congress to start this Biliteracy Research Network. And that's where, began this work and got to, work through the University of Houston and also Dr. Goldenberg. And, we learned a lot that we'd like to share today. And there's continued a lot of learning. Now, I will tell you that in our multilingual community, there's questions about our work. And I really want to talk about those questions and try to answer them best. But I want to tell you that I'm a bilingual speech and language pathologist and a certified dyslexia therapist, certified academic language therapist, and a qualified instructor, which took me longer to get than my highest degree. But the bottom line is we're always thinking about the language development of our students as we're thinking about their literacy development. And we have to take a very comprehensive look. And we've learned a lot in these years. We don't have all the answers. There's still much more to learn, but we have enough to know how to get these students off to a good start. And that's what I'd like to say. So thank you for inviting me here today with my wonderful friends and colleagues.
And let me just add one more thing, just real quick. It really is an honor to be sitting here with Elsa and Claude. I've read many of Claude's articles and followed some of his research, and Elsa and I have known each other for many years. And I'll tell you, we never stop learning, and we never stop getting coached and mentored. And I'm so appreciative to even though Claude doesn't know it really, I haven't told him personally, but he's been such a great mentor through his writing. And when I finally met up with him a couple of years ago, he continued on with his mentorship, and Elsa as well. So I thank both of you for all the hard work that you've already established, and it's just been an honor to be working with so many of these initiatives and projects right along both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right back at you. Not to continue this mutual admiration society, but
Yeah.
I think it's clear we have a lot of respect for each other's work, and I think we complement each other in very interesting ways, which is why I'm particularly excited to, start the conversation and address some of the questions that Laurel sent us.
And before Laurel talks, I'd just like to say our state superintendent gave us 3 names, and you are it. So we're so excited that we could have you, and just thrilled to learn from you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you guys. All right, so we are going to get started here with the first question, and the first question is addressed specifically to Dr. Cardenas Hagen. If you could give us an overview of what are the key findings of your research regarding the science of reading in English learners?
Yes, I'm going to try and share a screen. I just put together a few little slides here that sometimes having a visual can be helpful. So let me try and do that. We're in a place where we're on a Wi-Fi. I'm going to see if I can get to it. Let's see.
Got it.
Is it up there? Let me get to the slideshow. Okay. So, there's all these terms that come up, and so, we might call that instruction a comprehensive approach of what we've done and what we work on and continue to work on as structured literacy. And sometimes terms get misused or throw people into, oh, I'm not even going to listen. So, I think as moving forward, you have to be careful about what are the buzzwords that set people off, and give it to them in the kind of dosage that they're willing to listen and open their ears to. I mean, I'm just going to start off with that because sometimes when we use terms, it just shuts people down. But what's so important is that we began this really kind of large scale studies. We started actually in Texas in the 90s, but then to expand, working in Texas and California with Claude and his team, that was one iteration. And then we did what are called the scale up studies, which then included Colorado, California, and Texas, which are, were high numbers of English learners. And our work is cited in important documents that people should know about. And these documents, we know that everybody knows about this, this National Reading Panel, but most teachers don't know. Today, this morning, when my discussion, I asked, how many of you know about developing literacy in second language learners? And out of a couple hundred people, we saw maybe, a few people raise their hand. And so, we should start with national reports that, at least took a look and tried to do their very best effort to look at what was available, what did we learn. And then since this, Diane August and Tim Shanahan, because of some colleagues that had written about the work and, really questioned, followed up with other papers that really describe, here we've got 20, 30 more studies, and these 20 or 30 more studies say this, this, and that. So we know a lot. So we can start there. And in starting there, the idea was to look at those, 5 key areas of phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, which you hear. But what we've learned from that is that our English learners need more. And where they need more is that they are developing language as they're developing literacy. And when I talk about this, I'm really describing, because we don't really have enough solid ground on these, dual language programs happening at the same time. Now, that's not to say the schools that we were in, some had dual language, some had bilingual education models, early exit where, the students just got, a few years and then they moved into their English language. But what we learned is whether we did the intervention in their native language or whether we did the intervention in the second language, if we had those foundational skills that really took apart the structure of their language, and if we gave them that information in a systematic manner, which we began with, kind of early, more simple concepts, continuing to move up and really getting at that phonological awareness and phonics, while also we were working always on their vocabulary, on their oral language. We always had read alouds. The children loved doing those read alouds. And we adjusted to meet their language needs and to meet their literacy needs. And so what gets misconstrued out there is the thought that, this research doesn't exist and it didn't have English learners and it didn't consider their oral language skills, and which I'm here to tell you that is what we have always done, what we continue to do, and we've never not done that. So I'm here to dispel any myths that you might have heard otherwise, to say that we're not considering language skills. Of course, in culture, culture doesn't teach you to read, but what does culture do for you? What culture does in bringing in, ideas about the world that they can relate to, that engages our students and motivates them. It doesn't teach them to read. We need these foundational skills to be able to learn to read. And we need to take this from an asset point of view. So we always screened and we always knew exactly what do they know and what do they still need to know, so that we could become diagnostic and prescriptive in our teaching. So if you've heard otherwise, then it's just not the case. I'm here to tell you. And just talking about that, we've also done some work, for many years with Diane August, where we worked on really, and Sharon Vaughn was doing the science, we were doing the social studies, but really looking at, can we be working on vocabulary and content knowledge and literacy while they're learning those content areas? And so, the Institute for Education Sciences practice guides described the work, describes what we did, and describes how we integrated oral language, written language into content area to teaching. I'm just typically there's about 5 recommendations here, and I'm just showing you a sampling of, okay, here's 2 strong recommendations. And so nowhere does it say we're not paying attention to these elementary and middle school students where they need to develop their language skills as they're developing their literacy skills. Another report. This is promoting the educational success of children and youth learning English in 2017, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Again, another meta-analysis. What did it come, here's some key findings that students who are English learners, right? When you provide them that explicit instruction in that phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, reading comprehension, they added writing there. Yes, writing's a part of literacy, right? These are promising strategies. And so again, you hear over and over, what are the recommendations by this meta-analysis? Provide explicit instruction, develop that academic language during that content. Yes, we're going to provide those visual supports and verbal supports, language supports. Our students need opportunities to engage with one another and that peer-assisted listening opportunity. But we're taking it from an asset point of view. Let's get that home language. Let's learn about what is it that they know. Let's learn about their background knowledge and their culture and bring that in. It's an asset. But very important is we're always screening, because it's through the screening that we can find, right, any maybe perhaps risk factors, but it also informs our instruction so that we're prescribing and delivering exactly what they need. And then we get to monitor that progress. And if they need more assistance, then we're giving that small group support in literacy and in English language development for these students. So this has been the case for all of these years. And we've had some very good outcomes. We finished a project recently called the Model Demonstration Project. It's MTSS for English learners. And here, once again, we were trying to translate research to practice on what we learned and how can we deliver this in a framework, right, that's really looking at risk factors and having different tiers of instruction. And again, these are all for free at mtss4ls.org. We have literacy briefs there that will talk about children with disabilities and without disabilities, but they're all English learners. And how can we differentiate that language and literacy teaching? And how can we scaffold for their linguistic needs? And how can we bring in those language domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, be explicit, and develop? We were very strong in developing the educator knowledge, but we also had a family and a parent part to this work. And so we did this work. The information's out there, and we also have rubrics on how you can look at your model for English learners and see if you're developing. And so here's this 3-tiered model, but always taking into consideration, what level of language are these students? Are they at the basic level, intermediate, advanced? And what about those practices that bring in the language, bring in the culture, and attune to that linguistic knowledge that they have? And here also we have these rubrics for the MTSS. So these are tools that should be used. Campuses should be looking at them. There's action plans that you can do. And so I think what happens is we do all this work and people don't know about it and they don't know how to access or use it. And so, that's 5 years of work right there. And right now, my work is on what we call the model demonstration for students with dyslexia. But guess what? We're working in the core instruction, because how can you work on dyslexia if the core instruction in these school districts isn't sound? And so what I talk about is when we talk about structured literacy, it's based upon the foundation of language, and language is certainly key and a necessary skill for literacy. And even when we look at the brain, the language center and the reading centers, that it's right there. So we've got to integrate in very smart ways that students can have that speech sound system, can process those sounds, can produce them, can then translate them, and can figure out that print to that print, that symbol to the sound, and that sound to the symbol, right? So that's that inverse relationship. And that when we work on this, that we're thinking always about that phonology, that even that writing system, that orthography, how the words work. Excellent word learning strategies or morphology, and exposing them to really figure out the meanings of words. But it's not going to happen if we don't think about the child as a whole, all that they know, the other cognitive skills that must be in place as well, such as, do I have attention and concentration? Do I have great memory skills, working memory? All of that affects you as you read. But if we could get to those foundational skills early, we can prevent a lot of reading disabilities, and we can get them on a journey. We're not asking for much time. We're asking for minimally in kindergarten and first grade. That's typically when they'll get it. And if they're not done, then in second grade, let's continue to work on that. But let's get to, those higher level foundational skills. And if we're thinking about multiliteracy, then that will be in 2 or more languages, right? But also thinking about that spoken and written discourse and written communication, using those practices that will engage our students as well. So Claude talks a lot about, some of the studies which we did over a 10-year period of time. I just want to let you know. And the first iteration was us working both with Spanish-speaking students and English-speaking students. And we matched the language of any type of intervention that we did to the language of instruction that was already occurring in the school. We didn't ask the school to change their language of instruction model. Absolutely not. And we looked at skill levels across languages. And what we did is we did parallels. So these children were primarily instructed in their native language of Spanish. These children were primarily in English, but all of them were English learners, all right? And so it was here that we found that we could get good results both in English and in Spanish, in those foundational skills and in oral language proficiency by including those scaffolds for the English language, by front loading, right, with the information that they needed. So again, working on language while we were working on literacy. Claude also always points to Linnea Aries' works as a whole body of work. And Linnea and her team also found great results in those early years, working with students, teaching the foundational skills, but always bringing in language, vocabulary, visual supports, verbal supports as they were reading. So here are these, seminal studies that have done this work. And then we followed up the work. We followed up the work by releasing some of, because by releasing, how would you say, by having the schools do the work, right? And just kind of helping and guiding them along. And that is also possible as well. But what we did in these literacy support activities is to work on their receptive language, their understanding, and their expressive. And we had vocabulary skills as target and language skills as targets. And all of that helped us to get those kinds of outcomes. And Linnea Aries talks about those in her studies as well. And, some people will say, well, you took it from a deficit point of view. That is what some of our multilingual community is. If you took it from a deficit point of view, Elsa. And I say, no, we did not take it from a deficit point of view. We saw that there were risk factors in the first grade, and we intervened and we prevented a reading disability, and we followed these children for several years. And what we did in that first grade year made a difference for them compared to their control groups, who, by the way, who still were getting treatment. But it's just like what we did really made a difference. And it continued to make a difference as we followed them up longitudinally. So we need to screen and we need to find these risk factors. And screening is not diagnosis. Screening is finding a risk factor, and your data that you get from that screening help to design your instruction. That's what it's for. And then the children that get it, fantastic. Children that need more monitoring, need more help, we're going to watch them very carefully. Now, I found this study recently. I was just reading this one. I don't know, Claude, if you're familiar with this study, but it was quite interesting to me. And I don't know if Antonio, you've seen it, but what it was looking at these secondary level reading interventions and looking at the early literacy skill, but they looked at them for first grade and second grade ELL students. But what they did was quite interesting. They did direct instruction interventions, but they also did interventions that were more balanced literacy and more related to that ELL component. And when they looked at that in the end, what they found, and they had ELL students, and then they had some students that were going to be, and actually they weren't only Spanish speakers, they had speakers of Somalian, Sudanese, Vietnamese, but no matter what, they found that the ELL students benefited from early literacy interventions, direct instruction, and it found to be successful, with these students and just as effective with the English only students. But look at the very bottom. A critical finding from the study was that students enrolled in interventions that are described as ESL literacy services did not do as well as the students with direct instruction. And so, we can continue to kind of look at that, but children in these ELL populations, regardless of their primary language, have to acquire these same beginning reading skills. All right. Now, I want to point you to also work at the University of Houston, where, these early skills such as phonological awareness were looked at as well. And these are, thousands of kids. And so students who have these types of skills, we measure them in Spanish, we measure them in English, and we found when you have these skills, whether you're in that native language, when you have them in another language, guess what? Those skills transfer. And that is very helpful. So if they are going to get any kind of native language instruction, if they have that in their native language, that's going to help them with their second language, right? And so we want to incorporate. And then this is exactly kind of those correlations between that Spanish phonological awareness and that Spanish reading that's within the language, English phonological awareness, English reading. But look across languages, what's happening between these, skills of the sounds, English has about 44 sounds, Spanish has about 22 sounds. And so there's a lot of correlation that we can build upon. Your Spanish reading will really tell us if I have literacy in my language, it's going to help me with that second language. And it was found this bi-directional approach, a bi-directional, the correlations happened bi-directionally. So, one contributed to the other. And that makes just perfect sense to me. So those were some of the things I wanted to point out. I can, I don't want to take up everyone's time, and then here's some more references, but I just want to point out that you may have heard that the work has not been done, and that we haven't considered the language and the literacy. And I'm here to tell you, we have always in these, 20 something years, considered language and literacy very carefully, and we have always screened and we have monitored, and we continue to do the work, and we continue to learn more, and we continue to learn more about the implementation science that we're working on right now. But what we did works and continues to work, by the way. Oh, by the way, also in that study, when I was reading the study, I was like, oh my God, they used our materials that we developed in those studies. I had no idea. And then when I read further into it, I'm like, oh God, they used our stuff. So pretty cool.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful. Do any of our other two guests would want to add anything or have any comments?
Yeah, let me add something just really quick. I'm kind of jumping ahead because the final question has to do with policy recommendations for improving literacy skills for English learners. And so I am going to ask you, colleagues, to, as Elsa just finished talking about her area, and Claude will be addressing other questions, and we'll be chiming in on those as well, that you think about policy and you think about how does this affect what we're doing out in the state level, what we're doing at the regional level, what we're doing with universities and so forth and so on. So this is just, Elsa and I had a rather deep discussion a couple of days ago about, we keep on working in silos, colleagues, and we really have to think about how the entire how the field is going to be working together, and how do we take these findings and ensure that they do become policy and they become codified, so that it doesn't matter who's in position or who's not in position. These approaches and this instructional methodology is going to be utilized, because we know this. We know what is effective instruction. So how do we then make it policy so that we can go ahead and implement it across the board and have really greater levels of consistency? So let's just keep that in mind as well.
I would just add, second everything that Elsa said and that Antonio added on. One thing is, being clear about what research says, whether you call it science of reading, which has become an unfortunate term. It's become a lightning rod, and people hear science of reading, they're all for it, or they line up skeptical. So trying to keep the terminology at bay. But it's one thing to know what the research says, which is extremely important, but then it's really quite a different thing to implement that in a policy and practice oriented way that people understand, that is actionable. That you're going to get pushback no matter what, because people don't like their precious assumptions challenged. I mean, that's just the nature of being a human being, but you need to think about how you communicate it, how you involve people, because there, as you all well know, in Maryland, but around the country, there's just a lot of fractious argumentation over things that should not be arguments, that should not be points of contention. And a lot of it, I think, is the messaging. A lot of it is not taking into account seriously how people think about things, and that you don't change your mental schemes overnight just because you read a study or because you have experts come in and tell you what you should think. In fact, we know there's active resistance to that sort of thing. So implementing the policy, communicating, involving people who need to be involved in a sensitive but firm way. I mean, I'm not saying give away the store just so people will agree with you, but just be mindful of these two levels, understanding what the research says. And there can be controversies about that. You can interpret these things differently. There's going to be skepticism, some of it well-founded, some of it kind of ignorant skepticism. But then there's a level of implementation, how you go from what the science, what the research says to actually making it actionable. So people tend to take for granted, okay, we agree on the research, therefore it's very clear what needs to happen to change policy and practice. And it's not that straightforward. But Laura, if it's okay with you, I mean, I'd like to, using Elsa's wonderful information as sort of a backdrop, I want to get to your second question, if I might, which is how do the challenges of learning to read for ELs differ from non-ELs? And a lot of what Elsa said, I mean, sort of paved the way for my comments. I'm going to try to be a little more explicit about this, because even though there's a lot that was not stated explicitly about this issue, I want to see if we can't sort of dive in explicitly. But before I do that, I mean, I just want to know if from our audience, from our participants here, are there any questions or clarifications to what Elsa said or Antonio or what I said before I barrel ahead with another PowerPoint?
We do have a question from, well, we have a commendation from one of our work group members saying that was exceptionally helpful. Thank you. And then we have a question about, do you have a reference on how literate students in late middle school and high school could be supported? I've experienced several efforts where well-meaning decision makers, low literacy students in late middle school and high school could be supported. Several efforts where well-meaning decision makers use and adjust supports strategies for, and I'm not familiar with that acronym, FES. I was thinking foreign exchange students, but I'm not sure, who are not yet fluent English speakers, sorry, but have found them to be haphazard and minimally effective. So I think just talking about developing literacy skills for low literacy students at the secondary level.
Right.
So that's really challenging. There's some studies, Sharon Vaughn did some studies also in the middle school years, of where the students were low language, low literacy. They were, needing really special education, and the intervention was only like 10 weeks. And from there, in those, 10 weeks, it was found that, we didn't get the statistically significant, responses that we need. And at the University of Houston, we now have the Cecil Center, the Center for the Success of English Learners, really looking at these issues of what some might say, long-term English learners, adolescent English learners, so this is only like a year in progress, but that site, and there are some studies in that middle school, but it's tough. I don't know, Claude, if you have, some other studies for the middle school years that you want to bring up. But
I put in the chat a link to an article that I did that references some of at least one of the studies that I think Elsa is talking about. This particular article, speaks about the science of reading and reading more as an English learners and where they fit into all of this. And I look first at early literacy, and that's what I'm really talking about. Early literacy, if you're learning the language that you're learning to read in, and early literacy if you already know the language. But then the second part of the article talks about what about older learners, which is what this question is directed towards. And there were 4 studies I discussed there that address these issues, not with the specificity that the question asker, I think, would have liked, because research doesn't answer all questions and certainly doesn't speak to every context. But I think it reveals some, as Elsa said, some principles, some ideas for what to do with kids, EL specifically, who need that additional support and need that additional literacy and language development instruction. So I think some of those references might be helpful. Aside from that, one of the things that I found when I reviewed these studies, and this is actually going to be not very good news, is that the strategies that were used for English learners, a lot of them come into the category of sheltered instruction. I'm sure you've heard that term, PSYOP and so forth. They worked equally well for English learners and non-English learners. So what happened was the English learners were behind the non-English learners because, and these are all English measures, they were behind the English speaking kids, as we know. But then what happened is that the gap didn't narrow because it worked for both the English learners and non-English learners. So while you got a significant bump for both groups, that gap that we're so worried about between English learners and non-English learners, that gap was not directly impacted. And one of the conclusions that I drew from this, review of the research is that we really have to put a huge emphasis on developing English language proficiency, because the clear inference I drew from these studies is that as long as there's a gap in English language proficiency, then there's going to be a gap in their English literacy achievement. Now, I know people don't like to hear this, but it's a fact based on the research that you can't overcome that gap unless you help them accelerate their English language development. And we know the older the kids are, the more challenging it is. So that is the challenge that we face in middle school and up, helping English learners really accelerate their English language development. I don't know of a whole lot of studies that I could point to that would help us be optimistic about that, but it's certainly on the frontiers of where we need to push if we're serious about helping eliminate the long-term English learner issue, particularly those long-term English learners who've been in our schools for 8, 9, 10 years. English learners who come in 6th, 7th grade present their own challenges, but kids who've been in our schools since kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade, it's hard to understand why they're still English learners when they're in 8th, 9th, and 10th grade. We really need to focus on that in a very, very serious way. Maybe Elsa and her team will be leading the way. I think you're working more on secondary now, right, Elsa?
Yeah, so it's secondary. And I just also want to say, Claude, it is exactly what you're describing, that it's in just reviewing, it is looking like it's that language proficiency that's keeping us. It's a strong variable that is, we can teach them to read, but when they come in with low language proficiency, and we haven't made a difference there, we won't see that, kind of narrowing of that gap. And so it's figuring that out, and also looking at what Claude is describing, that some might say those long-term English learners, and really trying to understand better the context, because context matters. How, is this all because, there's so many variables, but what did we do? What did we do in the elementary school years? What was that language of instruction model? Did we present some of those gaps in the educational programming? And, because we tried to do a study where we looked at these different language models, dual language, bilingual education, early exit, late exit, immersion. And when it came down to it, there wasn't enough fidelity of implementation in each of those models as we go in and we're measuring minute by minute what teachers are saying and doing to really put out a language model. So we need to do better in how we implement to really understand. So I'm very I'm very, wary of studies that say, oh, this language model worked and this, because are they really going in and checking like we did, where we got so much variation? We thought, what do we do with this information? So, we categorized it about to this, it was primary this language, primary that language, because we couldn't figure out the language of instruction model. So we've got to do better at that, to learn more about that context and what is it about that context that's perhaps affecting those outcomes.
Yeah. And as someone put in the chat, the newcomers, some systems have newcomers program. Has any system shown effectiveness and results of language proficiency gains? Not to my knowledge. A lot of the research on newcomers really looks at what they're doing. There's been a lot of investigating and looking at them and analyzing them. But from what I can tell, there's very little evidence or even data that would help us understand whether one kind of newcomer program or whether newcomer programs in general work. I mean, I have no opposition. I mean, it makes a certain amount of logical sense. But some people think it's a form of segregation, that you separate out kids and you minimize the amount of time, the opportunity to get into the mainstream. So I'm not opposed to newcomer programs, but I don't have any information. I see Elsa shaking her head. Antonio, do you have any information about newcomer programs, if they work, different models?
No, and actually there are just limited material, especially for newcomers. So that goes back to relying on the knowledge base that we have as to the importance of oral language and how to, especially for newcomers, and how to build on that and how to be deliberate on that. And that's the knowledge base that we need to possess, but I don't see anything out in the field. Right. So yeah.
So let me, from being kind of pessimistic, let me shift a little bit and try to be a little more optimistic. Some things that I think we can claim with some, I wouldn't say certainty, but with some degree of assurance. And I'm going to address the question of how to the challenge of learning to read, the second question on the page there. Laurel, is it okay if I share? I think you have to unshare for me to share.
Absolutely. We can. Yep, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm going to do this. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm gonna, there you go, try to be brief here. This should only be a few minutes. So the question here is, how does learning to read and write, remember we really need to take writing seriously. Does learning to read and write in English, as you're learning to speak and understand it, how is that different from or similar to learning to read and write in English if you already know it? So very briefly, what I want to talk about and build on Elsa's notion of foundational skills, how critically important they are, but that so much more is needed. And I want to really focus on how learning to read and write in English, as you're learning to speak and understand it, is both similar to and different from learning to read and write in English when you are already English proficient. And then I want to end talking about some things that don't work for English learners, emergent bilinguals, multilingual learners. I use the terms interchangeably. What are some things that don't work and some of the things that do work for these kids learning to read in English? But first, let me just be very explicit about some of the things that Elsa said, but I want to be clear that there's nothing in what we're saying here. Antonio, Elsa, I'm not the spokesperson, but I know for a fact that none of us take an adverse or negative view of bilingual education. It's, as you know, the single most controversial issue in this field, and it's been for the past at least half century. But bilingual education is desirable for many, many reasons. But the fact is that most ELs don't have the benefit of bilingual education. And the reality on the ground is that most English learners have to become literate in a language they're simultaneously learning to speak and understand. But bilingual education deserves due consideration. One of the most confusing things that happens is they get sort of all bound together, and we don't make the distinction. They're very different kinds of programs. If at some point you all are interested in delving into bilingual education, pros, cons, so on and so forth, I mean, I'm sure the three of us would be happy to come and talk about that, but please don't anyone walk away from these presentations and assume that we are privileging English immersion or English only instruction, because we're not. We're responding to the reality on the ground that most kids who are ELs have to become literate in a language they're simultaneously learning to speak and understand. So learning to read, I'm going to say some things that should not be controversial. Involves knowing the sounds of the language and the letters that represent those sounds, using letters, sounds, and spelling patterns to read and spell words. It involves understanding the words. It involves having background knowledge to understand what you read. It involves sufficient language for comprehension. Now, these top two are typically called foundational skills: phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, letter sounds, decoding, phonics. Those are what are called foundational skills. But learning to read, being able to read, progressing as a reader requires all of these things, plus increasing fluency, and I would add increasing integration of these as reading proceeds, reading and writing proceeds, and as it develops. So you want to think of foundational skills as the foundation for a building, right? If all you have is a foundation, you really haven't got much. I personally wouldn't live in something like that. But without a good foundation, you've got trouble. Foundational means necessary. It doesn't mean sufficient. There's more to reading than foundational skills. And that's true whether you're an English learner or an English proficient student. And we have a worldwide literature that suggests that regardless of the language, foundational skills are essential for linking, as Elsa said repeatedly, linking speech to print and print to speech. That was Louisa Motz's, the thing that I took away from her book, which is very good. I would really recommend it. The title says it all: linking speech to print. That's what the process of learning to read fundamentally involves. Linking print to speech because, linking speech to print because speech comes first. You learn to speak, and then you learn to deal with print. And then you want to go the other way too, linking print to speech to print, and print to speech. If you can't do that linkages, literacy is not possible. It's as simple and as complicated as that. Language proficiency, vocabulary, background knowledge are also essential, and they become increasingly important as literacy develops. But they have to be addressed orally at the beginning and early reading stages until reading comprehension permit reading to learn. Elsa said that we address language from the very beginning. We absolutely do. We have to address language development. We have to address comprehension, but a lot of that has to happen through the oral channel, through read alouds, through discussions, because children can't absorb that by reading until they can read at a certain level. But you can't wait until they can read at a second or third grade level before you start addressing background knowledge and oral language. Those things have to go on at the same time, but primarily orally until the foundational skills are such that they can benefit from that through print. Now, getting to English learners and emergent bilinguals and English speakers learn to read, are they same or different? Well, first of all, foundational skills are foundational to reading. They have to be prioritized in beginning and early reading. And that's the same. That is the same whether you're learning to speak, learning to read in a language you know, or learning to read in the language that you're learning. And there is a worldwide literature on this. This is not research based just on English speakers in the United States. Foundational skills are not enough. More is needed. Language, knowledge, and various dimensions of those. That is the same. These first two are no different whether you're an English speaker or an English learner. Now, where things become more complicated is when you need to understand the words that you're being taught to read. English learners and emergent bilinguals need English language development so that they understand the words they're learning to read as they use their foundational skills to read them, then confirm them with meaning. So let me pause on that because there's a lot packed in there. When you think about it, kids who are learning to read in a language that they already understand, to the level that a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 4-year-old, 7-year-old, if they're English proficient, the kind of words that they're being taught to read, see, can, I, rat, bat. These words are in their lexicon. They're in their vocabulary. They know these words. They know what they mean. And it turns out that knowing the meaning of the words that you're being taught to read is important, not to recognize the words, but to confirm that what you're reading fits and is meaningful. Now, English learners don't have that advantage. I mean, by definition, they are learning the language in which they are being taught to read and to write. So what they need is the English language development so that they understand those words. So as they use their foundational skills, their phonological awareness, their letter sound knowledge, their decoding and phonics skills, as they're using their foundational skills to read, they can then confirm with the meaning of the words. If they don't have the meaning of the words, they can't do that confirmation. So understand, I'm not talking about the 3 cueing system here, where the theory, the misbegotten, I mean, misconceived theory that you learn to recognize words by using some combination of cues, meaning context, syntax, pictures. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about reading the words, using foundational skills, then being able to recognize the word to confirm that you're reading something that's meaningful. This is different for English learners. They need those foundational skills, but they need to be taught the meaning of the words so they can confirm their meaning. And the best demonstration of this principle is found in the 2 studies that Elsa cited a few minutes ago by Linnea Airy and by Sharon Vaughn, both of which I cite in the article that I put in the chat. Linnea Airy's quote in particular on page S135, I don't want to put the quote on the screen because I already got enough text up here. But if you look at that quote, it clearly says they're providing language, they're providing meaning, they're providing context, they're providing discussion and understanding the language the kids are being taught to read. And they're expecting the kids, as they read, as they use their foundational skills to read them, they can then confirm with meaning. Then in the appendix of the article, I have a long excerpt from Sharon's study, Sharon and Elsa and their various colleagues, that have a very nice description of the kind of language development, ELD, English language development support and activities that they did with the kids in order to support their literacy learning. So language is completely integrated into the lessons of the children so that as they use their foundational skills to read the words, they understand what they're reading, they can confirm with meaning, they can do what English speaking students can do without any additional instruction because English speakers already know the meanings of the words. So I would really point you to those two references, specifically the quote on page S135 and the Vaughn appendix, that'll give you a very clear sense of what kind of language development support is helpful for these students. Now, keep in mind that the students in these 2 studies were students who there were some red flags because of the screening that Elsa was talking about. They knew, the teachers knew, the educators knew that these children, they did not have dyslexia. You cannot diagnose dyslexia this early in their reading development, but you can see red flags. If they're having trouble, if they don't know letters and sounds, if they're having trouble with phonemic awareness, they don't discriminate the different sounds and words. Those are signposts that these children might have some difficulty. So these are all kids who are sort of getting difficulty, getting traction in their beginning reading skills. And these are the children that were put into these programs, into these interventions, and they got really significant bumps that had some payoff in terms of their foundational skills specifically, but then supported with language. Now, beyond beginning and early literacy, children need ongoing academic language development. And that's true. All students need ongoing academic language development, particularly when you get to those tier 2 and tier 3 words that are very technical, very scientific, very specific to the subject matter. But English learners need more of it because by definition, they're learning the language as they're learning the content and the literacy and the skills and the conceptual understanding. So you'll need academic language development is on one hand the same that everybody needs, but at the same time more intensive, more focused, more mindful of the fact that these students are learning literacy as they're learning the language. Now, very briefly, what does not work for English learners and emergent bilinguals? I could list a long catalog of things that don't, but let me just focus on two. Heavy diet of phonics and decoding is insufficient attention to the meanings of words and text. Unfortunately, we see a lot of that around the country and in districts where phonics and decoding has been taken to a level, taken out of context with insufficient attention to the meaning of words and text. That does not work. Nor does 3Qing work. 3Qing doesn't work for anyone using the combination of letters, syntax, pictures, and context clues to recognize words, right? This is sometimes called balanced literacy, but in reality, it's unbalanced and random. This especially does not work for English language learners because they don't have the meaning of the words, the context, the text, the vocabulary to actually make use of the cues. But even if they did, as we know, it's a terrible way to teach reading because kids are actually trained to do what learning disabled kids do because they can't read by using their phonics and decoding, so they have to guess looking at pictures and context. So what does work is instead of a heavy diet with insufficient meaning and of words and text, as much foundational skills as needed to master the code with ample attention to word and text meanings. And instead of 3Qing, what students need is to learn to read the words using decoding skills first, then confirming accuracy using meaning and context. It's a subtle difference between using these cues simultaneously and using them in priority. The priority is using your foundational skills to read the words, but then using meaning and context to confirm them. So just to summarize it, we need foundational skills instruction to master the code with ample attention to words and text and meaning, learning to read the words using decoding skills, then confirm accuracy using meaning and context. And we also need a lot of other things, continued English language development and support to comprehend texts, especially texts that are becoming more and more complex as they go up the grades. You need to provide content and background knowledge. You need to build on student assets, as Elsa mentioned several times. You need to provide relevant and motivating learning experiences and other things as well. These are the kind of things that work for English learners and emergent bilinguals. And I think you want to try to codify in some way, getting back to Antonio's point about policy and practice, you want to codify in some way in whatever legislation or Department of Education policy mandates, requirements, suggestions that you put out to help guide the field.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldenberg. That was full of useful information. I'm going to do a quick time check with this really quickly. We have about 9 minutes left to devote to this portion of our meeting today. So I want to give Dr. Fierro a chance if he would like to specifically address a question before we have to move on to our next portion of the meeting.
Oh, gee, Laurel, I'm so sorry. I thought we were going till 2. I should have you should have cut me off.
Not at all. I couldn't. It was so good. I didn't want to cut you off.
No, Antonio, I'm sorry. I thought we were going long. My bad.
No, that's okay. And I mean, I've been so fortunate to have been in other calls with my colleagues that I know that there's just so much information to share. And that's why I went on immediately after Elsa, because Elsa has so much rich information. Claude has just as much. And I just wanted to make sure that we all kind of follow through and saw how this information has to be codified. We have to provide that type of direction if we are going to make the changes that we need. Let me share. Okay. Awesome. Oh. So why am I seeing my calendar?
We're seeing your slides, I think. Ours says we see your slides.
Great.
We see your slides.
Okay. Now I see my slides too. Okay. So when we're talking about policy, we're trying to get the masses to go in a certain direction. It is about what Claude mentioned earlier. How do we communicate change and how do we involve the masses? And so it's almost like, oh, you kind of mentioned what I was going to talk about. I have a quick story to tell you, and it won't take very long at all. In 2015, I became involved with the Mississippi Momentum Project, but it really was a transformation across the state that included the Mississippi Department of Education really putting into effect policy. And part of that was the third grade reading law that was to be going in effect, I think, in 2019 or 2016, something along those lines. But the bottom line was that Mississippi always ranked at the bottom of reading scores. And I can tell you personally, I've been in meetings with other state leaders and hearing them say, thank goodness for Mississippi, because Mississippi is going to be at the bottom. And so we're not going to be there, but Mississippi will be. And that was enough. And so there were changes being made. So Mississippi's Department of Education was very strategic, very visionary in the sense of implementing policy to ensure that reading science was being taught, that teachers across the state knew what it was like to know the psychology of reading, how to deliver instruction, not only the science of reading, but also the science of teaching and learning. So teachers were provided with professional development around the topic of the science. But not only that, they said, well, there has to be more, because this has to be inclusionary. We must include all levels here. So we're talking about policy that was multi-dimensional, all right? Taking away the lead from the federal level, including the State Department of Education, including regional and districts across the state. So teachers were taught the science and taught the psychology of reading. The teacher candidates were also then subjected to or taught the science of reading. There was one issue. There was one minor issue, that the educator preparation programs across the state were still teaching balanced literacy, or very, very much an incidental approach to reading. So then the department said, we have to ensure that our faculty is also aware of what needs to be taught, and leadership, and the community at large. So the masses were informed, the policy was written, and everybody started going through their own journey of understanding how the science works, and for all students. All right? So there weren't silos, only general ed. Everybody went through this learning process, to include teachers working with English learners, to include interventionists, to include administrators. And to make a long story short, in 2019, Mississippi made the largest reading gains in the country. All right, and their children, minority children, Hispanics and African-American children made the largest gains as well. And there wasn't anything left to chance. Everything was deliberate. Everything was intentional. Teachers were well versed in instruction, in the cognitive science, psychology as well. So it was just amazing, the transformation, and it still continues today. So I'm talking about building policy that must be multi-dimensional as well. All right. We must prioritize the acquisition and application of reading science in schools, and ensure, though, that that our teachers are also, administrators, interventionists are supported by appropriate timelines, doable timelines, and the resources to include coaching if necessary, or really when necessary. And that's really where I think Mississippi got the biggest bang, the biggest success was because of the coaching that was being provided as well. So identify, especially with working with English learners, how instruction for English learners coincides with or diverges from the science of reading based on students who are native English speakers learn to read. And what does that mean? We all need those foundational skills, but also Elsa and Claude were talking about oral language and English language development. And what does English oracy look like for our English learners as well? So both of them really touched on specificity as well. And I think that's what we need to ensure, that we're not going to muddy up the waters. Identify those foundational skills needed for pre-K to grade 2, for example. Identify instruction that is needed for our older English learners. Progress monitoring. I'm so glad that Claude mentioned this as well. Progress monitoring of our long-term English learners, and we do not have a national database. Claude or Elsa, do you know of one? I don't think we have one, do we? But what we need to be able to monitor those children who have been identified as English learners and haven't been able to move beyond. Differentiation to account for the variability amongst our English learners that can be at the level of language skills, literacy skills, cultural and experiential backgrounds, and the development of oral language proficiency as well. If we have additional information, once we get additional information, what do those instructional models look like? And Elsa has a very good point of, I wish we could identify which model is most effective. You have, I think in Maryland, you have 10% of your student population that is English, that are English learners. Your data looks very similar to the national database, because I believe almost 80% of your English learners are Spanish speaking. All right, and you have almost 11%, I believe, of your English learner, of your student body that's English learners. That's very much the national number. So if you are providing bilingual education or dual language, what does that look like? Allow for planning and that homeschool connection. What do we know? How do we get that? Get the students' families to understand or know that we are working on this together, and they are welcome to provide assistance, to provide additional information. And of course, professional development must include all educators receiving the same instruction. And that goes across the board. And again, goes back to the silo thing. Everybody should be hearing the same thing. It doesn't matter if they're working with English learners or kiddos who need intervention. Everybody should be hearing the same thing. Now, I mentioned the Mississippi story because I was the coach of university professors who did not understand the science. And we knew, coaching was the key, and coaching continues to be the key. So I'm very, very passionate about the work that our institutions of higher ed are doing, and what are they teaching, and are they including reading science, right? So colleagues, especially in Maryland, that would be that was probably the missing piece in Mississippi that also made us go over the top, that everybody was on the same page. So foster interdisciplinary collaboration between professors of education, professors of cognitive psychology, neuroscience, speech, ESL, linguistics, language, and any other related studies, so that we all are doing the same thing, or understand not only the science, but also the science of reading, but also the science of teaching and learning. Let me make just one final item as a suggestion. For the first time in my career, and now I just celebrated 30 years in education, higher ed is getting a lot of attention. There is an initiative that was started right around the pandemic, titled the Path Forward Initiative, that supports and works with the transformation of educator preparation programs across the country. So there is support being given from the sense of, how do we go through this transformation? How do we ensure that our courses, our syllabi are appropriate, the textbooks, the assignments? The first cohort consisted of Arizona, Colorado, Massachusetts, Missouri, North Carolina, and Ohio. That they already went through the first cohort and are going to finish up their second year. The second cohort was just announced to include Alabama, Indiana, North Carolina, Wyoming, Minnesota, and Virginia. Let's not reinvent the wheel. These states have already been very, and I forgot to mention Mississippi, because Mississippi started the whole thing, but have been instrumental in making changes to their educator prep program. This morning, when I was speaking here at this conference, I said we do not have any time to lose. Our teachers, our teacher candidates must be ready day one, the minute they walk into their classroom, to start teaching kids how to read, how to develop language, how to build on the instruction, and that should be happening during your teacher preparation programs. So these states have done a great job of already beginning the transformation. Has there been pushback? Absolutely. Absolutely, but now there's power in numbers. I've always said it. So yeah. So misery loves company. No, they've been very very successful. And I turn it back to you.
Thank you all so much. There has been so much discussion going on in the chat, and I know I find myself sitting here nodding my head and having, generating lots of interesting thoughts as well. So we cannot thank you enough for joining us today at this meeting. I would like to, I know we had allotted for some Q&A time with our guest speakers in the essence of preserving a little bit of time. I think we're going to move forward with the rest of our presentation, and hopefully if we have, I'm happy to send you guys questions via email, or if we have some extra time at the end, maybe we can address them then.
Super.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Wow. We learned a great deal. That was powerful and very impactful. I'm sure everybody else is on the edge like I was. I mean, it was great to hear the intersection of the work that you all have done. So thank you so much. I'm going to run through these existing policies because we've been talking about it a lot throughout this day. And because I want to make sure that our other guests can show how their work is playing out in practice. So I'm just going to briefly talk about Maryland's existing policies and practices as they relate to, the science of reading and supporting ELs. Next slide. So as many of you know, Maryland Leads was a new grant initiative designed to support LEAs to use federal funds to overcome learning loss as a result of COVID-19. And it was great to hear our presenters speak to providing explicit instruction in literacy components. Right? Integrate listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Structured literacy is a foundation for language. And so these were the 7 high leverage strategies that our 24 LEAs had an opportunity to apply for. And as you can see, one of the main strategies focuses on the science of reading. And we distributed over about $165 million, plus the ESSER state set-aside funds through non-competitive but a highly selective grant process to add value to existing work or to begin this work. Again, this is a journey. Everybody is starting in different places, but this is a true investment to focus on structured literacy. Next slide. So just visually, so you can see something we want to always make sure we're transparent with is funding around different investments. And as you see, this is a distribution of investments across the high leverage strategies. And as you can see, in terms of the science of reading, the majority of the pie, 31%, is going towards that initiative. So we are super excited that our LEAs have taken advantage of this opportunity. Next. 22 out of our 24 LEAs, again, they're using matching funds, but have dedicated focus to the science of reading structured literacy approach. So we know that you can't just implement without training and professional learning, right? And so all K-3 teachers, special educators, literacy specialists, principals, in 22 of the 24 LEAs will be trained in the science of reading instruction. And the LEAs also have to commit to adopt and scale high quality, content-rich, culturally relevant instruction materials that are aligned to the science of reading. So again, that dedication to building on those foundational skills at the early grades, not just for our classroom teachers, but all of those who interact with children at an early age to make sure that they have those skills. Next. So I'm not going to read through these because I will tell you how you can access information on our website. But again, I explained to you who the audience is for this. And I just want to highlight a few counties. We have Frederick County. We just pulled a few examples. Teachers in Frederick, K-5 will receive professional learning related to science of reading. And they've set a very strategic goal, 100% of those folks being able to receive this rigorous professional learning around the science of reading. And again, we can't have people go implement, give them materials, say go implement without giving the professional learning that they need. So this is great. In Cecil County, they're creating a science of reading community of practice for teacher leaders to complete the training, special educators and Title I teachers. So they're going to develop the professional development and tools focused on evidence-based literacy practices. Next. In Allegheny County, they're going to be focusing on evidence-based content-rich materials. And they're creating a reading leadership team that will explore high-quality instruction materials, which is so important, just to make sure there's level setting and everybody is using the same set of materials. So they'll review research, they'll evaluate materials, use resources, sort of like the high-quality instruction materials review process. And then they'll be able to pilot those materials and use them. And then in Prince George's County, they're going to be providing some initial training. They've been doing science of reading work and training. So they're at a different, on a different level in terms of their implementation. So they are providing initial training to prepare teachers and leaders to implement MClass and DIBELS. And those are ways to assess students' reading progress. But they have been implementing science of reading. They're further along. So as I mentioned, next slide, there's information more detailed around Maryland Leads, and on if you go to this link on our webpage, there are one-pagers that summarize the strategies that each LEA is doing related to the Maryland Leads grant, but specifically you can see how they're implementing the science of reading. So you can take a look at that. So without further ado, I want to turn it over. We have Cecil County Public Schools, who graciously was able to join us today. Not to put them on the spot. Remember what I said? This is a journey, right? Everyone's in different places, and that's okay. So we thought it would be helpful to share an authentic example of what this work looks like in the field, and have one of our LEAs explain their journey and what they're doing in terms of putting in this to practice. So thank you so much, Sherry and Tammy, for joining us today. And I'll turn it over to you to present.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think, Sherry, you're going to start. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So we've organized to where I'm providing context and background in reference to the literacy program we're implementing in our county, in all of our 17 elementary schools, which is titled Bookworms. And we're going to speak to how Bookworms is aligned to a lot of, a number of pieces you've all discussed here and listened to today. And then Tammy is going to speak more specifically to the relationship and impact on English learners. Next slide, please. Okay. So here I just want to highlight a couple of things. There are 3 45-minute blocks of instruction, and we implement all 3. And I say this because in some districts, they implement either just one, the one at the bottom that you see, it's called differentiated reading instruction, or they implement the 2 at the top, English language arts and shared reading. And some districts implement all three. We are a district where we implement all three literacy blocks. A couple of things I just want to highlight there. In the ELA block, the structure for interacting with text is an interactive read aloud. And the lexile complexity is aligned to the recommendations of the Common Core. So students are listening to a text that's at the end of that grade level band as far as lexile or above. That's where the grammar instruction is explicitly instructed, as well as modeling of writing related to text, as well as genre-based writing strategy instruction, where those explicit writing instruction is provided for all three genres, each marking period or each quarter. And then you see in the second block, shared reading. And shared reading really focuses on the peer-assisted learning opportunity. They've taken the research from PALS, peer-assisted learning strategy, and they've incorporated a partner shared rereading structure after students chorally read, because the text here are also intending that level of complexity within that grade band. And this is where the instruction focused on vocabulary acquisition is also more explicitly instructed. And students are responding to written responses daily to demonstrate their reading comprehension. And then in the third block there, it's called the differentiated reading instruction block. And here, teachers are provided lessons that focus teachers' instruction where it's differentiated as far as where students are in the literacy continuum with foundational literacy skills, and it's meant to accelerate. So with this particular block of instruction, there are recommended screeners that align with our universal screener. We use Acadience as one of ours, as well as additional diagnostics to determine whether or not students begin in small groups focused on phonological awareness and word recognition, or they might be at the other end focusing on vocabulary and comprehension. Next slide, please. Okay. So something I just want to highlight here. Students are interacting with trade books here, full text on multiple topics. It was that the focus is the evidence-based pedagogy. And then the standards, right? The standards are not necessarily research-based, but the standards are also embedded into the curriculum, aligned to those evidence-based practices, supporting teachers with making the link between the two. Okay, the next slide. I'm not going to read through all of these pieces here, but from kindergarten to grade 5, students will have read over 250 texts. And what I really wanted to highlight here on this slide is number 2, which is that standardization across grades of evidence-based instruction and pedagogy. The teachers and students focus on building those foundational skills, fluency, comprehension, and knowledge building. Okay. Next slide. Here are the guiding principles. BWRW is just Bookworms Reading and Writing Program. The one I want to just revisit here is the foundational skills must be developed quickly. And that's referencing the differentiated reading instruction block, where students receive 15 minutes. So there are 3 small groups that occur during that time, 15 minutes of focused literacy instruction on foundational skills. And you can take a moment to look at those other components. Okay, and the next slide. I'm going to turn this over to you, Tammy.
Okay, and so we listed on the left-hand side those science of reading components, and on the right-hand side, we developed a list of what we thought were essential components based on the research we had done. It is not an all-inclusive list. For instance, it does not include building background knowledge. So I'm not saying that's not important. These are just the 5 we wanted to showcase today. So instead of diving into bookworms and saying, what does it do to meet ELs? We said, let's look at what the research says and see if bookworms includes that. And I'm going to dive into a few of those. We could easily check these off and say, yes, they're included. But what's more important for us to do is to take a look at the extent to which they are incorporated into the program and how intentional teachers are with overall instruction and routines that include those elements. And so, for instance, on the next slide, if we look at intentional vocabulary instruction, we know we need to focus on the meaning of words to help ELs make that connection between sounds and word parts. And this includes those simple words that a teacher would not consider to be a vocab word for non-ELs. And that's interesting because that was a big point in one of your presentations. So I'm happy that we are all in alignment there. Bookworms uses word study. So in grades 1 to 2, the focus is on pattern-based spelling with words in isolation that students can already read and use orally. So that doesn't always work for our ELs who might not know what those words are. But visuals were originally provided for kindergarten and grade 1, and they've been added over time for grade 2. So there are some supports and some scaffolds to help them with that word meaning. And then in grade 3, students progress towards studying syllable types and words chosen as vocabulary words. So this is where they would be learning to read and spelling while also focusing on meaning at the same time. And that continues into grades 4 and 5. So moving to the next one, the multiple meaning words. Oh, same at that slide. Sorry, Laurel. We know ELs need additional instruction as multiple meaning words are encountered, and Bookworms actually puts that into their scripting for the lessons. But I think this is where we still need a little bit more exploration to determine how intentional teachers are being with those polysemous words. Are they using additional supports? Are they creating word walls? Are they purposefully planning for multiple exposures to those words so that students as they revisit them, so that students can solidify them in their thinking and in their use? Word generation using word roots is included to some extent in grades 3 to 5. And that's, for us, in thinking about our new ELD standards, it's really important because we want kids to be able to use those skills as they move from social studies to English to science to math. And make connections across those content areas. We've talked about visuals already, but I'd like to point out that they're also used in addition to vocabulary instruction with anchor charts, text structures, sentence composing. And Sherry and I were talking the other day, and she said something that I think is important to share, and that is that DI, the differentiated reading instruction, and Bookworms intensives were actually, or they actually influenced the evolution of visuals in the program. So we look to see more of that happening. Now, the last two under intentional vocabulary instruction are things that we know we need to work on. So cognates. If teachers are bilingual, if they have a little bit more knowledge of learning languages or language acquisition, if they're also certified in ESOL, if they co-plan with the ESOL teacher, then they're more likely to use cognates as an additional support to building meaning and to building vocabulary. I mean, ideally, we would see teachers have a list of cognates for each text that they read, using at least with Spanish, since that's our dominant language outside of English. But to have a list of cognates for each text they read, to chart those and revisit those charts using a routine as they're encountered in reading. It also helps, it values students and the language that they bring to the classroom. And it also helps them realize just how many words they already know. And then intentional redundancy, for me, that's really like repetition. It's what we talk about in my other half of my job, which is in world languages. It's that idea of being intentional with the routines and practices, giving kids multiple exposures to vocabulary, making sure that we're planning for and implementing multiple times of kids seeing the words, hearing the words, saying the words, writing the words and phrases, and using it in context. But what we think it is, or what I'd like to say about that is it's really important to learning words is being able to use them and read them in comprehension and then apply them in reading and writing, or apply them orally and in writing with automaticity. So that repetition is what leads to that. And then the last piece you also mentioned, the oral language development. So this is naturally embedded into bookworms and into its practices and routines. And we know that students need structured ELs, students need structured academic conversations that are intentionally designed for them to use academic language, to elaborate when talking with their peers, to build up language, and to build up their ideas through those oral exchanges. And so one of the things that Sherry and I have talked about is that because of the rigor of pacing and the volume of text, we find ourselves still working toward balancing the pacing and fully engaging in those routines and practices that we know are necessary to develop literacy and language for our ELs. And there's one that's on the bottom. My bar is covering it up. I'm going to skip syntax and listening comprehension in the interest of time. Looking at time, and talk about academic language. So academic language is built into the first person scripting in bookworms, and it includes keywords from the Common Core State Standards. And the vocabulary is instructed daily in both shared reading and the ELA blocks. This is one of the things I really like. There is additional support, and it was added to support the language functions, to support syntax, and to support grammar. So those additional supports look like sentence frames or sentence starters. And we know that those are important for our English learners. Now, they're not universal supports yet, but we hope to build on those moving forward. So if we can go to the next slide. So what does this mean moving forward? To ensure that our literacy program aligns to the best practices for English language development. So we know that we need to provide professional development to support teachers in leveraging those strong routines and practices within the program. We know we need to adjust supports for ELs at different proficiency levels and make use of their linguistic assets. We have done some work already in our school system with designing assessments for ELs for social studies and science, and we look to do the same for our ELA curricula. And we need to increase collaboration. And that's where Sherry and I really come into the fold, with the two of us working together to go into the classrooms together to look at bookworms instruction through both an ELA lens and an ELD lens. And then I would say in the end, if we are really going to be about English learner success, we cannot rely solely on programs. Their success depends on people as well. And it requires having teachers who understand how language is involved in literacy development. So going back to our EL Workgroup's recommendations, I think it's recommendation 4, growing our own, getting more teachers certified in dual language or in ESOL, so that they know what the students need and they can take that firsthand knowledge and not skim over something that is really important for ELs because they didn't recognize it as a monolingual teacher of ELA, but they would instead have a stronger skill set, having certification and coursework about English language development and English language or reading.
Thank you so much. This was definitely time well spent. I'm glad you all had an opportunity for us to hear an authentic experience. You know, I myself and the superintendent have heard a lot about bookworms. So And we've, talked before. It's so great to hear you all articulate it. Ilhay, before I move on to you, I think we should check to see if anybody has any questions. I'd like to give an opportunity for our guest from Cecil to respond. I see in the chat, this is wonderful, Tammy and Sherry, an asset-based approach. Nice recommendation, Tammy. Great job to all the presenters. Have to say one thing that you said that stood out to me, which I appreciate because I've always believed it. I've seen it in my own, practices, is language is involved with literacy development. I mean, that is so key. So thank you for reiterating that. Anyone else have a question or comment? You can drop it in the chat, or we can have you come off mic quickly before we transition to close out our meeting.
Deanna, I actually have a question. I thought that was a terrific presentation. Thanks very much. I have a question about your opening slide. You have the literacy block, the 45, 45, 45. And I was a little puzzled by this because there's no differentiation by grade. In other words, is this what happens K to 6, K to 5? I see
Yes.
Sherry nodding. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But
So
I would
it's what
imagine the
happens.
content. I mean, I would imagine the content changes or the balance of foundational to other skills shifts. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes. So as far as the content, so the practices and routines and all of the content is anchored within the text. And the text are, by design, each text is a authentic piece of text, whether, regardless of the genre. So in the different grade levels, students are reading both narrative and informational text in each of those grade levels, whether that's text is read aloud to the student, or they're chorally reading the text, or their partner rereading the text, or they're reading the text independently. And so that happens in each of the grade level. And so by design, the text used in each quarter are different, and they are lexed out accordingly from the beginning of the grade level to the end of the grade level. And then for the differentiated instruction block, there's a staircase of proficiency is the language used, where the bottom tier is phonological awareness and word recognition. The next tier is word recognition and fluency. And then you have fluency and comprehension and vocabulary and comprehension. And the target is that by the end of, really by definitely end of first grade, students are in that fluency and comprehension tier. Now that's if the student's on target from instruction from the kindergarten, right? And then through kindergarten, they're going to be successful with that phonological awareness and word recognition small group instruction, and there are lessons provided. And then entering first grade in what's described as word recognition and fluency, and that begins with instruction focused on blends and digraphs, for example. So that instruction occurs at each grade level. Now, what happens is for students who do not meet those proficiency levels, they're instructed in 14-day cycles, 15 minutes of instruction, right? Then there are additional approaches. Sometimes they're provided that instruction again at another time of the day. And then sometimes there are resources incorporated like sound drill, letter keyword sounds, as well as additional components related to literacy, where they take the text instructed in shared reading and they bring some of those practices related to vocabulary acquisition and writing down into the differentiated instruction block. And that's a new piece they're designing right now that Tammy had spoken to earlier. It's called DI Intensification and Bookworms Intensive. And the intent there is to provide additional tiered supports for students who might need, whether we call that tier 2 or tier 3 supports, who are not meeting those proficiency levels at that time in that grade level.
So how would you characterize the instructional model that you're using, particularly for foundational skills? Is it direct instruction? How would you characterize?
Yes. Mm-hmm. It's explicit instruction, explicit teaching in each of those small groups on those bottom two stair steps in reference to decoding and phonics instruction, right? And then when they transition to the fluency and vocabulary, that's where they then incorporate those evidence-based practices. And some of those same practices are also used in the shared reading block, as well as the ELA block, like the interactive read aloud, for example. And then teachers look at supports from, like, for example, echo reading to chorally reading to partner reading to independent reading. So there's continuums of supports that are provided during that small group instruction. And some of those same supports are provided to the whole class as well, depending on the text complexity and the needs of the students.
Thank you.
And those same evidence-based practices are consistent within the grade level and across grade levels. Just some of those scaffolds change, which inform the change in the practices over the grade levels.
Got it. Thanks very much.
So are you saying that you have a scope and sequence from simple phonological awareness and phonics concepts, and you move direct, explicitly, and systematic and cumulatively? And then right now you don't really have the interventions per se, but are working on those intense interventions to provide that design and materials for the teachers to do that for tier 2?
Yes. Well, we do have interventions. We do have multiple programs right now at this time, but what we are also exploring to align as far as supports, when we're talking about instructional supports and staffing supports, we do have other interventions that are offered during this time. And because we have that third literacy block, it does allow for other programs to be used. For example, some students in grades 3, 4, and 5 may participate in Wilson, which is a tier 3 intervention during that time. Those students who have not responded to the instruction and progressed at the expected rate and met those targets. And so we do offer other interventions, but what we are exploring this year, and this is part of some of the things we put into the grant, was to explore what's called DI intensification and bookworms intensive, where they use ABA intervention and that explicit teaching, bringing in that explicit teaching and progression for phonics, where they do start with basic alphabet knowledge to letter sounds, letter patterns, and then go into more specific blends and digraphs, vowel teams, etc. And they move along this progression, and teachers are provided resources to provide that explicit instruction during that time and move students along the progression. And they're provided the progress monitoring tools to adjust accordingly.
And Sherry, if I can interject, with our English learners, we've been very clear about being very careful that we're not pushing English learners to an intervention when really what they need is more tier 1 instruction. So we are cognizant of that.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm sorry to cut the conversation short. We could probably stay here much longer. I want to make sure we have a chance to provide updates on our EL report. But again, to all of our guests who joined us today, we are truly grateful. I know that those who are watching live, I'm glad we're recording it so we can all circle back and watch and listen again. But thank you to all of our guests today. This was amazing. I know, I'm sure everyone like myself learned a great deal, and we are just very appreciative. So thank you so much. Ilhay, I'll turn it over to you to take us to the last part.
Thank you, Dr. Collins. So we have a few slides that we have prepared, but I mean, we had such lively, interactive, very informative discussions. So what we are going to do is we really do want to spend a little more time talking about literacy and English learners. So we'll just go through these slides. We have interim report, preliminary recommendations listed, and then so you are familiar with those. So we will be writing final report, incorporating all those things, but we also have several additional recommendations based on the meetings that we had this school year. So the next one we have is number 9, the funding allocations and spending decisions. You know, we spent 2 full meetings on funding. So we will be talking about that in the final report. And then the next one is about accountability and reporting. Again, we spent 2 full meetings on that. So we have lots of great ideas and great feedbacks from you guys. So we will write more detailed report on that.
And then the following one is about making sure that we have effective English language development programs. So we talk a lot about high quality instructional materials, how to make the materials accessible to ELs that are high quality. And then we are going to develop some guidelines around, excuse me, around that. And the next one is about literacy instruction aligned to the science of reading that meets the needs of multilingual students. So one idea, which as many of you are maybe familiar with, the interim report is written with the title, topic, or theme. And then we had several bullet points. Now, because it's going to be the final report, we will call them action items. So these are the kind of things that we will do to assist local school systems. So based on the presentation today and lively conversations that we had, we would like to gather some feedback for you. So what sub-bullet that we can have to ensure the literacy instruction is really meeting the needs of English learners or multilingual students. So if you have any feedback, you can just speak up or you can write it in the chat box. So we could capture your feedback and we can write the final report on that.
And of course, we received several in, we've been taking notes, so we received several in the actual presentation, duly noted. Go, Tammy.
I really like Claude's do's and don'ts. If you didn't record that, that's a—
Oh, we have the recording.
We have.
Okay, great.
And also the recommendation to codify some of the, it's not just enough. We certainly we need a recommendation, a bullet here about training for pre-service teachers and for teachers in practice, but also to codify some of the important components we want to be included in reading programs across the state for English learners.
Absolutely.
I think
I get a little concerned about the interventions and what interventions are appropriate for ELs and which aren't. And I know we already have some language related to that. And I don't know if there have been discussions about whether or not this is going to be part of this.
We could certainly suggest, we do have a document about reading instruction. I think, Tammy, that's what you're referring to. And we did really say that how important it is that Tier 1 instruction is. And all three of our national experts have discussed that. And then the importance of the extensive and explicit vocabulary lesson or instruction, and as well as oral language. So we're hoping to say it, even if we don't say it in the final report, we will be developing a guidelines or the guidebook, so then LEAs have a clear understanding about that. Connor, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but go ahead.
Sure. I wanted to, it's really just repeating things that Claude and the presenter said, but it would be good if MSD could find ways to also reiterate the value of early literacy abilities in the L1, the home language. And especially, we saw slides around the common underlying proficiency, the cross-pollination of early phonics in languages like Spanish that have overlapping languages or alphabets rather with English. That in particular would be really valuable to have, the stamp of the state insisting on this, because again, I don't think there's any real tension here around elevating the value of emerging bilingualism and retaining the importance of the science of reading and instruction.
And then we have some comments from Paula talking about embed required reading credits for certification into EL literacy strategies, and also tools for assessing L1 literacy and reading levels. Good ones. I'm jotting all those down. As I was
listening to our presenters today, something popped in my mind as, someone who spent a lot of time in the classroom watching instruction happen, is that I think it is very valuable to talk about the need for oral language development and what ELD looks like. But I think that one of the places that's where the connection is missing is that a lot of classroom teachers don't know what oral language development looks like, right? So we say oral language development, but if you're a classroom teacher, you might not necessarily know what strong oral language use or oral language development looks like in practice. So I think it's important to outline or even have models of what that might be.
Laurel, can I make a comment about that? I think that's a very good point, but I would want to make a distinction between the oral language development that I was focusing on in the beginning and early reading stages. It's very targeted development to the words and the text that kids are being taught to read. Now, but pointing that out would provide a scaffold for teachers who are not comfortable with or don't have ELD training, because it's pretty circumscribed. Now, kids need more than just that ELD, but for purposes of early literacy development, you want to really telescope in to the words and the text that they're being taught to read and are being expected to read. But then on top of that is the broader conception that I think you're talking about, that I would completely agree with, which has payoff in other domains other than just early literacy. But there's a distinction between those two that I think is important to make.
Thank
Well,
you.
and I'll add on to what Dr. Goldenberg just said. That's so key, especially for secondary students in particular, when it comes to writing, that they need the opportunity to speak it and say it and organize their thoughts before they can put it on paper. I think it's done a little bit more naturally in elementary, but certainly needs to be done more. But I think the expectation is from a secondary teacher, and I did this myself as a French teacher, I just already expected all the kids coming to me already knowing how to read. So I never really knew how to teach reading. And I think that's generally the way it is with secondary teachers. Elementary, they're learning to read, and by the time they get to secondary, they're reading to learn.
Dr. Goldenberg, I just want to make sure I understood what you said. I'm really interested in this. Are you saying that at the early grades, kindergarten, grade 1, maybe grade 2, that the words they're studying have to come from the text and not be separate lists? Or could you just reiterate that for me? I really want to understand it.
Yes, that specifically, no, good. Thanks for pushing on that, because I think precision is really important. That for the purposes of beginning and early literacy development, reading specifically, but it also applies to writing. For purpose of beginning and early literacy development, you want to make sure that English learners, I think it's exactly what you reiterated, Tammy, just a few minutes ago, that they need to, that what I said kind of reinforced what you all are doing, that you're making sure that English learners understand the meanings of the words that they're being taught to read. They're being taught to read words. You're probably not teaching them nonsense words. Later on, you can use nonsense words to test their decoding skills. But early on, what you're doing is you're teaching them how to read see, cat, can, I, right? Words that are normally in the vocabulary of English proficient students. So they can do what I was talking about, which is decode the word, then confirm, oh yeah, that's a word I recognize. That's something that's meaningful. English learners can't do that because you can't assume, as you yourself said, you can't assume that they know the meanings of those words, and teachers don't think about teaching them as vocabulary because they don't have to teach them as vocabulary to their English speakers. You have to teach them as vocabulary, or at least check to see if the kids know it in the case of English learners. So that for purposes of literacy development, knowing the meanings of those words in the text that they're being taught to read is critical, is fundamental, but by itself is a very impoverished ELD curriculum, because the vocabulary and the texts that are used to teach kids to read is by definition kind of limited, because you're helping them kind of get a toehold on the sound, symbol, speech to print whole thing. They need a broader conceptualization of English language development for all sorts of purposes, in addition to what they need for teaching, for learning to read. So it's a very constrained definition of ELD for purposes of early literacy, and you need a more expansive definition of ELD for everything else. Does that answer your question, or did I just muddle it again?
No, I thought I had it right, and then I kind of tricked myself, and I'm good. Thank you so much.
Maybe I used too many words and just
No, you're good.
No, thanks for bringing that up, because it's really important, and more, it's really supported by the research. And if you take a look at those 2 excerpts that I told you from Linnea Airy, she makes it very, very clear. You got to teach them to read the words using their foundational skills, and you need to provide the language support that allow them to realize that it's making sense. Otherwise, it's just all nonsense word reading. You're still
Well,
looking-
sad to say, we're over time.
All right. sorry about
Jason,
that.
give us, no, don't be sorry. This is, you don't see us leaving. But we're trying to be fair to all of our participants and make sure they can move on to their next meeting, and especially those of you in California. So we thank you very much. If you haven't had a chance to speak up about any of the recommendations, feel free to share your ideas with us. And we'll be talking more in our October meeting about the EL report.
Yeah. And Tammy, feel free to contact me if you want to pursue this, because it's an important point and I don't want to slough it off.
I appreciate that.
And we may need it as we're writing the report too. So thank you.
I'm in.
Thank you very much. This has been amazing. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Thank you all.
all.
Thank you.